Can you guess what happens when a 72-year-old man walks into one of the toughest prisons in the state? The prison cafeteria fell silent the moment the new inmate walked in. He was old, calm, and didn't look like he belonged there. That's all the gang leader needed to see before he smirked. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, blocking his path. "You lost your nursing home?" The other inmates laughed. The old man didn't. He just stood there, eyes steady, breathing slow. Then, with one move, the tray clattered. The gang leader hit the floor, and the laughter stopped. No one knew it yet, but the man they were mocking wasn't just another prisoner. He was a retired kung fu instructor with a past that could break every bone in that room. Want to know how this old man turned an entire prison upside down? Stay with Whispered Tales until the end, because what happened next made even the guards freeze. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The steel doors of Riverside State Penitentiary clanged shut with a sound that echoed through every corridor like thunder. It was a sound that broke men before they even saw their first cell. But when 72-year-old Samuel Washington heard those doors close behind him, his expression didn't change. His weathered hands remained steady at his sides, his shoulders straight, despite the orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his lean frame. The intake officer barely looked up from his paperwork as he processed the new arrival. Another old-timer caught up in the system. Probably some white-collar crime or a drug charge from decades past finally catching up with him. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just another number to fill another cell. But if that officer had looked closer, really looked, he might have noticed something different about Samuel Washington. The way he moved with purpose, even in shackles. The way his eyes took in every detail of his surroundings without seeming to stare. The way his breathing remained controlled and measured, despite being in one of the most violent prisons in the state. Samuel had been a free man for 72 years. He had taught martial arts for over 4 decades, owned 3 successful dojos, and trained everyone from scared teenagers to seasoned police officers. He had lived a quiet, disciplined life built on respect, honor, and the ancient teachings passed down from his own master decades ago. Now, he was prisoner number 84291, and the next 5 years of his life would be spent behind these concrete walls. The cell block Samuel was assigned to was controlled by one man, and everyone knew it. Tommy the Bull, Richardson, was 6'4" of pure intimidation, his pale skin covered in tattoos that told the story of 2 decades behind bars. His crew of loyal followers moved through the prison like they owned it. And in many ways, they did. Tommy had built his empire on fear and violence. He decided who ate and who went hungry. He determined which inmates got protection and which ones became targets. The guards looked the other way because Tommy kept order in his own brutal fashion, and that made their jobs easier. When word spread that a new fish was coming to the block, Tommy's interest was immediately piqued. Fresh meat meant fresh opportunities to remind everyone exactly who ran things in Cell Block D. The first time Tommy laid eyes on Samuel, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. An old black man, probably older than his own father would have been if the old drunk was still alive. Gray hair, wrinkled hands, moving slow, like every step hurt. This wasn't just easy prey. This was a gift. Samuel's first night was quiet. He made his bunk with military precision, organized his few belongings, and sat reading a worn paperback book until lights out. He didn't speak to his cellmate, a nervous young man named Marcus, who had been counting down the days until his own release. "You seem different," Marcus whispered after the lights went dark. "Most new guys, they're scared or angry or trying to act tough. You're just calm." Samuel closed his book and set it aside. "Fear and anger cloud judgment," he said softly. "Clarity comes from stillness." Marcus didn't understand what that meant, but something in the old man's voice made him feel safer than he had in months. The next morning brought Samuel's first trip to the cafeteria, and Tommy was waiting. He had positioned himself and his crew near the entrance, making sure every inmate would have to walk past them. It was a power move, a reminder of the hierarchy that existed in this place. Samuel entered the cafeteria, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since his arrival. He moved to get his tray, his eyes scanning the room, not with fear, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent decades teaching others how to defend themselves. The food was exactly what he expected: watery eggs, burnt toast, coffee that looked like it had been sitting since yesterday. He took what was offered without complaint and began looking for a place to sit. That's when Tommy made his move. Well, well, well. Tommy's voice boomed across the cafeteria, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. Look what we got here, boys. Somebody's grandpa got himself locked up. Samuel continued walking, his tray steady in his hands, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with bullies before, though not quite in this setting. The principle remained the same. Show no fear, but avoid unnecessary confrontation. Tommy stepped directly into Samuel's path, his massive frame blocking the way to the tables. His crew flanked him on both sides, grins spreading across their faces as they anticipated the show. I'm talking to you, old man, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. When somebody speaks to you in here, you answer. That's how respect works. Samuel stopped walking and looked up at Tommy calmly. I heard you, he said simply. I just don't have anything to say. The response caught Tommy off guard. Most new inmates either cowered in fear or tried to act tough. This old man was doing neither. He was just standing there, completely unimpressed by the display of intimidation. You don't have anything to say? Tommy repeated, his voice getting louder. Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. See, I run this block. That means everything that happens here goes through me, including where an old fool like you gets to sit. Samuel remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. Years of meditation and training had taught him to find calm in the center of any storm. This was just another storm. I understand, Samuel said quietly. You're the man in charge. I'm just trying to eat my breakfast. Tommy's face flushed red with anger. The old man's calm was making him look weak in front of his crew, in front of the entire cafeteria. That couldn't stand. Without warning, Tommy reached out and shoved Samuel hard in the chest. The force should have sent the elderly man stumbling backward, maybe even knocked him down, but Samuel's feet seemed rooted to the floor. He absorbed the impact, shifted his weight slightly, and remained standing exactly where he had been. Tommy blinked in surprise. He had put real force behind that shove, enough to move a man half his age, but the old man hadn't budged. Did you just? Tommy started to say, but Samuel cut him off with a look that made the gang leader's words die in his throat. For just a moment, Samuel's mask of calm slipped, and Tommy caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator that had been pretending to be prey. The moment stretched like a taut wire. Tommy stared into Samuel's eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years behind bars: uncertainty. The old man's gaze held depths that spoke of training, discipline, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. But Tommy was the king of Cell Block D, and kings don't back down from challenges, especially not from some elderly man who probably couldn't run a block without getting winded. You think you're tough, old-timer? Tommy snarled, stepping closer until he was towering over Samuel. You think those tired bones can stand up to what I got waiting for you? Samuel's response was barely above a whisper. I think you should let me eat my breakfast in peace. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at the far end of the room had noticed something was happening, though they weren't moving to intervene. Not yet. Tommy's crew was getting restless. They fed off their leader's energy, and right now, that energy was building towards something explosive. One of them, a wiry man with tear tattoos named Snake, stepped forward. Tommy, you want me to teach Grandpa some manners? Snake cracked his knuckles, eager to please his boss, and put on a show for the crowd. But Tommy held up a hand. This was personal now. The old man's calm was eating away at his authority with every second that passed. He needed to end this himself, decisively and brutally. Nah, Tommy said, never taking his eyes off Samuel. I got this one. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come on Whispered Tales. Tommy drew back his massive right fist, putting every ounce of his 250 pounds behind a punch designed to shatter the old man's jaw. It was the kind of blow that had dropped men half Tommy's age, the kind that ended fights before they really began. Samuel saw it coming from the moment Tommy's shoulder tensed. 43 years of martial arts training had given him an understanding of body mechanics that went beyond conscious thought. The punch was powerful but telegraphed, thrown with emotion instead of technique. Time seemed to slow as Samuel's body moved with fluid precision. His left hand came up in a gentle arc, deflecting Tommy's punch just enough to send it harmlessly past his head. At the same moment, his right palm struck forward with surgical accuracy, connecting with a pressure point just below Tommy's sternum. The technique was called Iron's Breath, and Samuel had spent decades perfecting it. Applied correctly, it could disrupt balance and send a man crashing to the ground without causing permanent damage. Applied with full force, it could stop a heart. Samuel held back. Tommy's eyes went wide as the breath exploded from his lungs. His massive frame folded in on itself as he dropped to his knees, gasping like a fish out of water. The breakfast tray Samuel had been holding clattered to the floor, spilling its contents across the concrete. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Snake and the rest of Tommy's crew stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible leader, the man who had ruled this block through fear and violence for over a decade, was on his knees in front of an elderly inmate who looked like he should be playing chess in a park somewhere. Samuel looked down at Tommy with something that might have been pity. "I asked you nicely," he said, his voice still calm and controlled. "All I wanted was to eat my breakfast." Tommy struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. The humiliation burned worse than the pain in his chest. Every eye in the cafeteria was on him, waiting to see how the king would respond to being dethroned. "You," he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Samuel, "are dead. You hear me, old man? Dead." But even as he made the threat, Tommy knew something had fundamentally changed. The aura of invincibility that had protected him for so long had been shattered in front of everyone. Word would spread through every cell block by evening. The bowl had been brought low by a man old enough to be his grandfather. Samuel picked up his spilled tray and walked calmly to the serving line to get a replacement meal. The inmates parted before him like water, their eyes following his every movement. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with curiosity, a few with the kind of fear they had once reserved for Tommy alone. As Samuel found an empty table and sat down to eat, conversations slowly resumed around the cafeteria, but they were different now. Hushed, careful. The power structure that had governed Cell Block D for years had been turned upside down in the span of 30 seconds. Tommy and his crew retreated to their usual corner, but the swagger was gone. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, planning their revenge, because in a place like this, what had happened couldn't be allowed to stand. The old man had embarrassed Tommy in front of everyone, and that meant war. Samuel ate his eggs methodically, seemingly oblivious to the storm gathering around him, but his awareness was absolute. He could feel the hostile stares, hear the whispered conversations, sense the violence building like pressure in a steam pipe. He had hoped to serve his time quietly, to keep his head down and count the days until his release. But 40 years of teaching martial arts had taught him that some conflicts were unavoidable. When faced with a bully, you had two choices: submit or stand your ground. Samuel Washington had never been one to submit. After breakfast, as inmates filed out of the cafeteria, several men approached Samuel. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others offered protection, sensing that aligning themselves with the man who had humbled Tommy might be wise. A few even asked if he would teach them what he knew. Samuel politely declined all offers. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford in a place like this. But as he walked back to his cell, Samuel knew that his quiet time was over. Tommy wouldn't let this stand. The old martial arts instructor had survived gang members, drug dealers, and worse during his years running dojos in some of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. He had thought violence was the answer to every problem. But this was different. This was a prison, and he was vastly outnumbered. That evening, as Samuel lay on his narrow bunk, reading his book in the darkness of their cell, Marcus whispered across the cell, "Is it true what they're saying? That you're some kind of kung fu master?" Samuel closed his book and set it aside. For a moment, he was lost in memories of a different life. Training sessions that lasted until dawn, students who looked up to him with respect and admiration, a world where his skills were used to protect and teach, not to survive. "I was a teacher," he said finally, "for a very long time." "What did you teach?" Marcus asked. "Discipline, control, how to find strength in stillness." Marcus was quiet for a while, processing this information. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "Tommy's going to come for you. Him and his whole crew. They can't let what happened today stand." Samuel stared up at the ceiling, where a thin shaft of light from the corridor painted geometric patterns on the concrete. He had known this moment would come from the instant he decided to defend himself in the cafeteria. The only question was when and how Tommy would make his move. "I know," Samuel said simply. "Aren't you scared?" Samuel considered the question carefully. Fear was a natural response to danger, but it was also a choice. You could let it paralyze you, or you could acknowledge it and move forward anyway. "Fear is just information," he said. "It tells you to be prepared, but it doesn't have to control your actions." The next morning came with the sound of cell doors sliding open and boots echoing through the corridors. Samuel rose before the wake-up call, as was his habit from decades of early morning training sessions. He folded his blanket with precise corners and prepared for what he knew would be a different kind of day. Marcus stirred on the bunk below, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're already up?" "The body remembers discipline even when the mind wants to rest," Samuel replied, straightening his orange jumpsuit. "Today will require both." Word of yesterday's incident spread through the prison like wildfire. As Samuel walked the corridors toward the showers, conversation stopped. Eyes followed his every step. Some inmates nodded with newfound respect. Others quickly looked away, not wanting to be associated with the man who had humiliated Tommy Richardson. The shower room was nearly empty when Samuel arrived, which suited him perfectly. He preferred solitude for his morning routine. The hot water was a luxury in this place, and he let it run over his weathered shoulders as he reflected on the path that had brought him here. A tax evasion charge. 3 counts of failing to report cash income from his dojos. The kind of white-collar crime that usually resulted in minimum security facilities and early release for good behavior. But overcrowding had landed him in Riverside, and now he found himself in the middle of a situation that required skills he hadn't used in anger for over 30 years. As he dried off and dressed, Samuel heard footsteps approaching, multiple sets of boots moving with purpose. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the metal mirror showed him everything he needed to know. Snake entered first, followed by 2 other members of Tommy's crew. They spread out in a semicircle, blocking the only exit. Their body language spoke of violence barely contained, of men eager to restore their leader's reputation through brutal action. "Morning, Grandpa," Snake said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Tommy wants to have a word with you." Samuel continued buttoning his shirt, his movements unhurried. "I figured he might." "Smart man," Snake said. "See, what happened yesterday? That was embarrassing for all of us. Made us look weak in front of the whole block. Can't have that." "I understand your position," Samuel said calmly, "but I won't be going anywhere with you." Snake's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Wasn't really asking, old-timer." The first man moved forward, reaching for Samuel's arm. What happened next was so fast that Snake barely registered it. Samuel pivoted on his back foot, his hand shooting out in a swift chopping motion that struck the attacker's wrist with surgical precision. The man cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his arm as feeling left his fingers. The second attacker rushed in from the side, swinging wildly. Samuel ducked under the punch and drove his elbow upward into the man's solar plexus. The breath exploded from his lungs, and he doubled over, gasping like a landed fish. Snake backed toward the door, his eyes wide with disbelief. 2 of Tommy's best enforcers had been neutralized in less than 10 seconds by a man who looked like he should be collecting Social Security checks. "This ain't over," Snake snarled as he helped his injured companions to their feet. "Tommy's got plans for you. Big plans." "Tell Tommy he knows where to find me," Samuel replied, straightening his shirt once more. "I'll be in the library." The library was Samuel's sanctuary in this concrete hell. Rows of worn books lined the walls, most donated by churches and community groups. The selection was eclectic, ranging from romance novels to philosophy texts to technical manuals. Samuel had found a corner table where he could sit with his back to the wall and a clear view of all entrances. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Chun, who had worked at Riverside for over 15 years, had seen inmates come and go, witnessed violence that would haunt her dreams, but she had also seen moments of genuine transformation. Something about the elderly man who spent his mornings reading philosophy intrigued her. "You're different from most of the men in here," she observed as Samuel returned a book on Eastern philosophy to the return slot. "We're all different, Mrs. Chun." Prison just strips away the pretenses that hide those differences. You speak like an educated man. What brought you to this place? Samuel selected another book from the shelf, running his fingers over the worn cover. Poor choices and good intentions. The road to this place is paved with both. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other inmates. Samuel noticed them immediately. Men he didn't recognize from Tommy's usual crew, hired muscle from other blocks, brought in to handle a problem that couldn't be solved internally. Mrs. Chun sensed the tension immediately. "Perhaps you should go," she whispered to Samuel. "I can call for guards." "No need," Samuel replied softly. This was always going to happen. The hired muscle approached with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others through sheer presence. The leader was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of countless violent encounters. They called him Crusher, and his reputation preceded him through every cell block in the prison. "You must be the old man causing all the trouble," Crusher said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Tommy Richardson sends his regards." Samuel closed his book carefully and set it aside. "I suppose talking this through isn't an option." "Talking time's over, Grandpa. You embarrassed the wrong man." The library erupted into chaos as other inmates scrambled for exits. Mrs. Chun retreated behind her desk, reaching for the emergency button that would summon guards. But Samuel knew that help wouldn't arrive in time. It never did when you needed it most. Crusher moved with surprising speed for his size, his massive fist cutting through the air towards Samuel's head. But Samuel wasn't there when the punch arrived. He had slipped to the side, his movement so smooth it seemed like he had simply faded from existence. The old man's counterattack was swift and precise. His palm struck Crusher's kidney with enough force to drop a normal man, but the giant barely grunted. Years of prison violence had hardened him beyond normal human limits. Crusher spun with a back fist, catching Samuel across the shoulder and sending him stumbling into a bookshelf. The second attacker joined the fray, swinging a makeshift weapon fashioned from a toothbrush handle and a razor blade. Samuel caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and heard the satisfying crack of breaking bone. The weapon clattered across the floor as its wielder collapsed, screaming. But Crusher was relentless. He grabbed Samuel in a bear hug, lifting the smaller man off his feet and squeezing with enough force to crack ribs. Samuel's vision began to blur as the air was crushed from his lungs. In that moment of crisis, Samuel's training took over completely. He drove his thumbs into pressure points along Crusher's arms, disrupting the nerve signals that controlled grip strength. The giant's hold loosened just enough for Samuel to break free. Samuel dropped to the floor and swept Crusher's legs, sending the massive man crashing into a table that collapsed under his weight. Before Crusher could recover, Samuel was on him, his hand positioned at the giant's throat in a hold that could render him unconscious in seconds. "Yield," Samuel said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. Crusher's eyes went wide with panic as he felt his air supply being cut off. He had never been in a position where his size and strength meant nothing, where technique and knowledge trumped brute force so completely. "I yield," he gasped. Samuel immediately released the hold. The library fell silent except for the groaning of injured men and the sound of approaching boots as guards finally arrived. Samuel stood slowly, his orange jumpsuit torn and his shoulder aching from Crusher's blow, but otherwise unharmed. "What happened here?" demanded Sergeant Martinez, the head of security for Cell Block D. "Disagreement over a book," Samuel replied calmly, straightening his torn shirt. "It got out of hand." Martinez looked around at the destruction, the injured inmates, and the elderly man standing calmly in the center of it all. His experience told him there was more to this story, but prison politics were complicated. Sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions. "Medical attention for the injured," Martinez ordered his men. "And you?" He pointed at Samuel. "Solitary confinement, 48 hours. Samuel nodded, accepting the price to pay for sending a message that would echo through every cell block in the prison. The old man wasn't just dangerous, he was unstoppable. As guards escorted him away, Samuel caught sight of Tommy Richardson watching from the corridor. The gang leader's face was a mask of rage and frustration. His hired muscle had failed spectacularly, and now every inmate in Riverside knew that Tommy's reach had limits. The solitary cell was 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete and steel, a narrow bed, a steel toilet, and walls that seemed to press inward with the weight of isolation and loneliness. Most inmates emerged from solitary broken, their minds shattered by the crushing loneliness. Samuel used the time to meditate, to center himself for what he knew would come. Reputation was built on fear, and fear required constant reinforcement. Tommy, the gang leader, couldn't let this stand. He would come himself this time, bringing his entire crew and any allies he could muster. When Samuel emerged from solitary 48 hours later, the prison felt different. Conversations stopped when he passed. Even the guards treated him with a cautious respect that hadn't been there before. Word of the library incident had spread beyond Riverside's walls, carried by visiting family members and transferred inmates. Marcus was waiting in their cell, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Man, I thought they might never let you out. The whole block's been talking about what you did to Crusher. Is it true? Is Tommy still planning his next move?" Samuel asked, settling onto his bunk. "Oh yeah," Marcus said. "He's called in favors from every gang in the prison, Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, even some of the black gangs that usually don't work with whites. He's promising them territory, commissary money, whatever it takes." Samuel nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. His actions in self-defense had escalated a simple bullying situation into something that could tear the entire prison apart. "How many men is he gathering?" 20, maybe 30, Marcus replied. "All serious players with nothing to lose." Samuel closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had sustained him through decades of teaching and training. But for the first time since arriving at Riverside, he felt the weight of genuine concern settling on his shoulders. 30 violent men, armed and organized. Even with all his training and experience, Samuel knew that some battles couldn't be won through skill alone. The question wasn't whether he could survive what was coming. The question was how many others would be hurt in the process, and whether standing his ground was worth the price that others might pay. That evening, as word spread through every tier and cell block, Samuel sat quietly on his bunk, knowing that tomorrow would bring the storm he had been trying to avoid. The whispers carried details of Tommy's growing alliance, names of dangerous men from every corner of the prison who had agreed to participate in what was being called the biggest coordinated attack in Riverside's history. Marcus paced nervously in their small cell, occasionally glancing at Samuel with a mixture of awe and terror. "Man, they're saying Tommy's got guys coming from maximum security. Lifers with nothing to lose. Why don't you just ask for protective custody? Get transferred out of here." Samuel looked up from the meditation pose he had assumed on his thin mattress. "Running away doesn't solve the problem, Marcus. It just moves it somewhere else." "But this isn't your fight anymore. This is war," Marcus said. Samuel replied calmly. "It became my fight the moment I decided not to let Tommy pour my breakfast on the floor. Everything that's happened since then has been a consequence of that choice." There was something in the old man's words, a certainty that spoke of a man who had faced impossible odds before and found a way through them. "You really think you can take on 30 guys?" Marcus asked, his eyes distant. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "When I was younger, I might have believed I could. Age teaches you humility. But sometimes you don't fight because you think you can win. You fight because it's the right thing to do." The morning came with an eerie quiet that settled over cell block D like fog before a storm. Samuel rose at dawn, as he always did, but today felt different. The air carried tension so thick you could taste it. Even the guards seemed on edge, their usual casual demeanor replaced by alert watchfulness. Marcus had barely slept, his eyes darting to the cell door every few minutes. "They're coming today," he whispered. "Everyone knows it. The whole prison's holding its breath." Samuel nodded slowly, folding his blanket with the same precise movements he had performed every morning for months. "Then today, we find out what we're really made of." As the cell doors opened for morning count, the usual shuffle of feet and murmur of voices was replaced by an unnatural silence. Inmates moved carefully, keeping their heads down, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Even the most hardened criminals knew when to stay out of the way. Samuel walked to the cafeteria with measured steps, his breathing controlled, his mind centered. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with fear, and more than a few with the hungry anticipation of spectators waiting for blood. The cafeteria felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Tommy sat at his usual table, but today he wasn't alone. The faces surrounding him told the story of every alliance he had forged, every favor he had called in, every threat he had made. Aryan Brotherhood soldiers with swastika tattoos, Mexican mafia enforcers with dead eyes, black gangs who had set aside their usual hatred of Tommy's crew for the promise of territory and respect. Samuel took his tray and found an empty table in the center of the room, not hiding in a corner, not seeking protection near the guards, right in the middle where everyone could see him, where there was nowhere to run. Can you imagine one man standing against an army of the prison's toughest? The attack came without warning. Tommy's signal was subtle, just a slight nod of his head, but it unleashed chaos. Men rose from tables throughout the cafeteria, moving with coordinated precision toward the elderly man sitting calmly with his breakfast tray. What happened next would be whispered about in prisons across 3 states for decades to come on whispered tales. Samuel moved like water flowing around stones, his body shifting and turning with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The first attacker's knife thrust met empty air as Samuel stepped aside, his palms striking with surgical precision at pressure points that dropped the man instantly. 2 more came from his left, swinging makeshift weapons with lethal intent. Samuel ducked low, swept one man's legs, and used his falling body to block the other's strike. His elbow found ribs, his knee found a solar plexus, and both attackers crumpled. The room erupted into complete pandemonium as more men joined the assault. But Samuel was no longer fighting individuals. He was fighting the mob itself, using their numbers against them, turning their aggression into a weapon that struck down their own allies. His movements were poetry written in violence, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next. Decades of training had prepared him not just for combat, but for this exact moment when skill would face overwhelming odds and emerge victorious through pure discipline and understanding. Guards rushed in with riot gear, but they found something they had never seen before. One man standing calmly in the center of a room filled with groaning, defeated attackers. Samuel's orange jumpsuit was torn, but he was unharmed, his breathing steady, his hands at his sides. Tommy lay unconscious near the overturned tables, his grand alliance shattered along with his reputation. The king of Cell Block D had been D.